Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Just returned home from a weekend trip with the wife to Colorado. Visited some relatives she hadn't seen in 15, 20 years. We both visited Jaden, the Gadsden flag backpack boy. He lives in Colorado Springs, so we were able to say hi to him and his family, which was pretty fun. And just have a relaxing weekend away. So just got home and wanted to pop on here and continue the weekly tradition this week, talking about a topic that rankles many people. The topic being secession, with a scriptural twist at the end, so stick around. But this topic is deeply upsetting to many patriotic Americans who consider it tantamount to treason, and who allege that those who harbor this sentiment that states should be allowed to secede from the Union are anti-American, are not patriotic, or treasonous, fill in the blank. They just can't even imagine and fathom and contemplate such a scenario. So let's talk about it. Let's muse together. So lately this has been called a national divorce. This term has been floated around, and some of the MAGA, Republicans have been citing it. What's fascinating about this topic, however, is that when American voters are surveyed on this question of breaking up the country into several pieces or allowing states to secede, there's not a majority support currently, but there's a lot of support. So, for example, there was a poll 2 years ago, and the statement said, "The situation in America is such that I would favor blank states from seceding from the Union to form their own separate country." Now, that blank was filled in whether they were talking to a Biden voter or a Trump voter. If they were talking to a Biden voter, they would say, hey, do you think... If they were talking to a Biden voter, they would say, do you think blue states should be able to? And then for Trump, it's red. So for the Biden voters, 41% believe that they should be able to withdraw from the Union and have a contingent of blue states, perhaps, that are able to do so. For the Trump supporters, it's 52%. So I guess that is a majority right there, but not a majority of Americans on the whole. But 41%, 52%, this idea that states seceding from the Union to form their own separate country has a significant amount of support. There was, in a poll recently, the pollsters broke up the United States into several geographic chunks, and that was the basis of their question to individuals. So, for example, California was lumped together with Oregon and Washington. And so voters in those states were asked, would you support these three states getting together and leaving? Alaska as well, and Hawaii in the mix. So that was the Pacific chunk. And then the mountain states, it's Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. So anyways, continuing throughout the country, they broke it up into different regions: the Heartland region, the Northeast, and the South. Since I'm from Utah, I'll share the Utah stat. 43% of Republicans supported breaking up into a mountain region or a new country comprising this mountain region. 43% of Republicans, 35% of independents, 17% of Democrats. So the Democrats are almost like 3 times less than the Republicans. And yet, when we go to the Pacific states, California, Oregon, Washington, 47% of Democrats would support the Pacific states forming their own country. 33% of independents, 27% of Republicans. So that's almost double the Republicans double the Democrats than Republicans, when in the mountain states, it's almost 3 times more Republicans than Democrats. So, point is, there's a lot of people who are interested in this idea. Why are they interested in this idea? Why are people entertaining the idea of breaking the United States up into several countries? Well, let's first ask the question, is this legal? Would secession be legal? I posted on Twitter about this the other day, and bunch of people are like, oh, that's sedition, that's treason, oh, there's this law in this Supreme Court case. Okay, so in the United States Code, Title 18, secession falls under seditious conspiracy. And it says that if two or more people in any state or in any place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States conspire to overthrow, put down, or to destroy by force the government of the United States, they shall each be fined or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. So that's if you conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force. Well, secession isn't trying to destroy necessarily by force. It's not trying to overthrow a government. The government from which they are seceding would continue to exist. They're not trying to put it down. One might perhaps try to argue that because you're leaving it, you're putting it down, you're being negative about it, like insulting it, kind of putting down, when in reality this type of put down means to like terminate the government, like you're putting down an animal type of thing. Okay, so in 1869, of course, we're dealing with the Civil War here and all the southern states for slavery and economic realities and sovereignty and all these kind of mixed ideas that swirled together. Different people had different ideas why they were supporting secession. So there's a Supreme Court ruling in 1869 in Texas versus White. And this held that secession was unconstitutional. The majority opinion in that case said that the union of the states never was a purely artificial and arbitrary relation, saying that the Constitution in all its provisions looks to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states. Basically, they said that the Confederate government never actually seceded from the Union because the Constitution doesn't give states that authority. That was the basic argument. The flaw in that argument is that the Constitution doesn't give states authority. The states, under the Constitution, cede some of their pre-existing authority to form and empower a federal government, but they retain, under the 9th and 10th Amendment, all powers not particularly described and delegated in the Constitution. So here you have the Supreme Court saying, oh, the Constitution doesn't give you power to secede, so you didn't actually secede, therefore all this is unconstitutional. And so under Lincoln, through the actions of the Civil War, remember, his goal was not to emancipate slaves. He said that repeatedly prior to and during the Civil War. A lot of people are like, oh, he fought the Civil War to free the slaves. That is a public school level education of history, which is to say wrong. Lincoln's express purpose was to, in his words, save the Union. He wanted to prevent the southern states from seceding. Slavery was secondary at best. That issue was a side issue for him. He wanted to export all black people into their own little, separate country and force people out. And so under Lincoln's efforts then through the Civil War, what was before a voluntary federal union of states saw the relationship drastically change. And then it became a national, central relationship. So we had sovereignty before, now we had subservience. I mean, the Civil War is the point at which the federal government reigns supreme thereafter over the states. And this relationship changed from voluntary union to forced union. And so, by the way, well, I'll get to this in a minute. There's a book that I enjoyed reading years ago on this topic that I'll recommend. So, again, you get people who claim that secession is un-American. Someone even said on social media, on Twitter, advocating secession is practically by definition un-American. Well, the silly thing here is there wouldn't even be a United States of America if the colonists had not seceded from the British Empire. The various state legislatures and the colonial governments seceded from their government. They withdrew participation. They disaffiliated. So secession not only is not anti-American, it is inherently American. It is the only reason why America exists, was because of secession. And saying that secession should be treated as treason means that there no longer exists any voluntary participation of the states. There's no more, it's an express admission that there's no more voluntary union. To say that if you want to leave, that's treason. So it just admits that the relationship between the states and the federal government is all out of whack. Now, it's important to remember that, think of the Declaration of Independence. This was not from an existing country or a newly forming country. The Declaration of Independence was from 13 distinct and separate colonies. These were each independent entities that were declaring their independence. And so when we read in the Declaration of the King's establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states, it also talks about the colonies being affirmed as free and independent states. Or think of the Treaty of Paris that ended the most of the conflict between the crown and the states. It recognized each state individually by name, as opposed to the United States. There was no kind of central entity. It was 13 individual countries that were negotiating for the conclusion of the war. Like in the Declaration of Independence, for example, when it talks about the United States of America, did you know, pop quiz, that the word united is lowercase? Because it was not a title of a nation. It was not the United States of America. It was the United, as an adjective, the United States of America. The states were united, lowercase u. And so they were united in objective, but they were separate in status and sovereignty. They were separate entities. And this is important. For example, the Articles of Confederation that they later formed, it said that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated in the United States, to the United States in Congress assembled, and recognize that the states were voluntary participants. So here's the book. I read this like 8 or 9 years ago. It's called One Nation, Indivisible, A Study of Secession and the Constitution by Robert F. Hawes, Jr. And on page 88, and there's a lot of things I underlined in here years ago when I read it. Here's one portion. Again, talking about the Articles of Confederation that we just talked about in this union of states, separate states. It says, by allowing the dissolution of the Articles of Confederation without the unanimous consent of the states, the Founding Fathers set the precedent that some members of the Union could withdraw without the approval of all of the members, even though this meant the dissolution of the entire Union. In short, given the fact that the founders approved of the dissolution of an entire union by less than all of its member states, from a union that declared itself to be perpetual, no less, can we then look to them to condemn the actions of a minority of states whose secessions could be enacted while leaving the union itself intact between the non-seceding states? Can we condemn the southern states for seceding? This is talking about during the Civil War, or prior to, rather. Can we condemn the southern states for seceding without asking the permission of the northern states? When the 9 states that originally ratified the Constitution, and thus dissolved the entire Union at that time, did not look to the other 4 for permission to do so? In other words, the Articles of Confederation said this is a perpetual union, but allowed states, sovereign states, to withdraw, to secede, under a supposed perpetual union. And that's indeed what happened. Not only did the founders secede from Great Britain under the Declaration of Independence, they later seceded from the perpetual union established in the Articles of Confederation. And the 9 states with their ratifying conventions that said, yep, we're doing the Constitution, dissolved the Articles of Confederation without the permission of the remaining 4 that had yet to ratify the Constitution. And so why would those same founders not be supportive of the same under the new Constitution? Defies logic. Of course, those who argue against this don't really use much by way of logic. Union implies disunion, the potential for it. Just like consent requires the potential for dissent. If you are asked to consent to something, then your agreement to it is not actual consent unless you have the power to dissent. If you are asked to pay someone $100 bill and they're forcing you to do it, maybe under threat of, execution, they have a gun to your head, right? That is not consent because you don't have the ability to dissent and keep your life. So that's not true consent. That individual, that robber cannot claim, well, he gave it to me. He consented to me having this $100 bill. We would never agree that that's consent because there was no potential for dissent, right? So same thing with union. You can't have United States. There can be no union unless the potential for disunion exists. Unless people can voluntarily leave, then there is no union. The states are not united. It is a misnomer. It is a false label. And ever since the Civil War, when this question has been settled, so they say, the relationship of the states to the federal government has completely transformed, and we have this monolithic, oppressive, Leviathan government ever since. The states are in bondage. It's like an abusive marriage where there's no escape, right? Because leaving, or secession, leaving is seen as impossible. So you're trapped in this abusive marriage. Okay, I mean, there's lots of stuff I could say here. So sovereignty, which is the ability to choose your own future, it requires the ability to self-determine and choose who you want to and don't want to affiliate with. And so the threat of secession is a restraint on the union itself, ensuring that there's majority agreement, right? Because if states can start leaving, if they get really upset over a policy, then that's going to restrain the actions of Congress. If there's going to be discontent enough to have states leaving, if the potential for secession exists, it is a check and a balance on centralized control. And yet, if no state thinks that they can, if everyone thinks that this is a settled question and that secession is treasonous, no one's even going to attempt it or consider it, then Congress, or the central government, can get away with a whole lot of shenanigans because no one's going to leave. Okay, so let's address that question. And we're going to get to the scriptural part of this in just a moment. Didn't the Civil War settle this issue? This is the frequent claim of detractors who in their ignorance on the matter, simply claim that the Civil War settled the issue. Okay, so you and I are debating an issue, right? Let's say we're debating, whether Bitcoin is better than gold. And we're engaged in a debate over that concept. If I assault you, if I punch you in the head and beat you to smithereens, does that mean I win the debate? Am I right because I used violence against you and subdued you to my will? Of course not. That's stupid. And yet, that is what people are effectively saying when they're claiming that the Civil War settled the issue. Right? Might does not make right. The fact that a particular war ended in a particular way does not settle a moral, intellectual, constitutional question at all. I mean, like here in Utah, we passed a school choice bill this year, right? And 15 years ago, when Utah first did it, the teachers union fought it, a bunch of money dumped in from the National Teachers Union. They overturned the school choice law. And for years and years and years, people would say, oh, well, it's the will of the voters. It's a settled question. It's a settled issue. We're not going to touch that issue, right? And people didn't want to deal with that issue because they felt that it was settled. Well, it wasn't settled at all, right? New people come along, fresh blood, new ideas, new experiences like COVID and all the learning loss and the crapola happening in government schools and everything else. And all of a sudden, people are reconsidering their previous positions and saying, well, maybe it's not a settled issue. It never was. Just because some people didn't want to deal with it or didn't want to address it or wanted to use that past electoral outcome to justify their own position. whatever, right? You can have your reasons for deciding whatever you want, whether they're real or made up. But the point is, it's not a settled issue. And this issue is not settled. I mean, prohibition, right? You could have said, oh, well, it's a constitutional amendment. It's in the Constitution. It's now a settled issue. Until it wasn't. Until they amended the Constitution again and overturned prohibition because it was all ridiculous. Okay, now for the scripture, as we conclude here. 3 Nephi 7. So the preface here is that the Nephites are starting to prosper. Now there are class distinctions. There's a lot of pride. There's a lot of wealth. There's a lot of dissension in the church. None of this we can relate to today, right? There's no prosperity and class distinctions and pride and wealth and dissensions in the church. And so in 3 Nephi 6, the prophets are crying repentance. The secret combinations murder the chief judge. And so then we lead into 3 Nephi 7. I'm going to read a selection of verses from that chapter. So starting with verse 2. And the people were divided one against another. Of course, we don't have that sentiment today either. And they did separate one from another into tribes, every man according to his family and his kindred and friends. And thus did they destroy the government of the land, just like the founding fathers destroyed the Articles of Confederation, you might say. Or their allegiance to Great Britain was destroyed. So they had destroyed the government of the land by dividing into tribes. Now all this was done, and there were no wars as yet among them. This was not a bloody conflict. This was not a civil war. There were no wars as yet among them. And all this iniquity had come upon the people because they did yield themselves unto the power of Satan. And the regulations of the government were destroyed because of the secret combination of the friends and kindreds of those who murdered the prophets. And they did cause a great contention in the land, insomuch that the more righteous part of the people had nearly all become wicked. Yea, there were but few righteous men among them. It's an interesting thing to think about as it pertains to the wheat and the tares and the modern church and the problems in the church and the problems that will arise in the church. Continuing, verse 9. Now this secret combination which had brought so great iniquity upon the people did gather themselves together and did place at their head a man whom they did call Jacob. 2 more verses. And it came to pass that they were not so strong in number as the tribes of the people. So the secret combinations weren't as strong as all these tribes, who were united together, save it were their leaders did establish their laws, every one according to his tribe. Nevertheless, they were enemies, notwithstanding they were not a righteous people, yet they were united in the hatred of those who had entered into a covenant to destroy the government. So there's a lot of disagreement between these tribes, a lot of enmity, a lot of disagreement and so forth. And yet they had a common enemy, which was the secret combinations that were pillaging them and plundering and killing them, or trying to. So they had a common enemy. They were united in their attempt, almost like colonies that have a lot of disagreements with one another, uniting under a common government for purposes of foreign policy. So here you have these tribes who were had their own government, their leaders established their own laws, but otherwise they were united together. Final verse, 14. And it came to pass in the 31st year that they were divided into tribes, every man according to his family, kindred, and friends. Nevertheless, they had come to an agreement that they would not go to war one against another. But they were not united as to their laws and their manner of government, for they were established according to the minds of those who were their chiefs and their leaders. But they did establish very strict laws that one tribe should not trespass against another, insomuch that in some degree they had peace in the land. So I find that interesting. There's scriptural precedent for, look, a fallen people, because if everyone's righteous, you can all be united under one government and kumbaya, and there's no poor among you, and everything's fine. I mean, the form of government almost doesn't matter if people are truly following God. God is our king. That is the ultimate and true form of government. So under this fallen world, when Satan's controlling all these governments and the secret combinations are running amok, here is scriptural precedent for a wicked people dissolving their government to separate into tribes with kindred and friends, like-minded people. Even though there's disagreements between all of you, you can still unite together for purposes of foreign policy and defending yourself against a common enemy, and do so with an agreement that there wouldn't be internal conflict between these different tribes. There was no war. They had peace. It's interesting. Interesting. So, I'm not going to argue that the Book of Mormon says secession is okay, but I do think, and you will too if you were to read this book, One Nation Indivisible, that under the Constitution, it is, in fact, completely permissible for a state to secede. Now, it's hard to do so if the other 49 states are willing to violently assault you if you try to leave, citing a settled issue from a conflict under an authoritarian president 160 some odd years ago. But constitutionally and legally and historically and intellectually and everything, I think it's the rational position. Do I think that it should be done today? Do I think that, it's a moral imperative? I mean, not necessarily. I see this more as an intellectual exercise than anything else. I'm not going to go out and campaign for a national divorce and anything like that. But I've held this position for 15 years. And I just find it comical that so many people get so emotional about it and so reactive to it that they just equate it with anti-American sentiment and treason and all the rest. When for me, a super patriotic, freedom-loving guy, I just think that it is constitutionally authorized. It's historically been done twice by the founding fathers. And there is no constitutional limitation on it. The states did not empower the federal government to refuse their secession. They had just seceded themselves. They wouldn't even contemplate that idea, let alone codify it in the Constitution. So more of an intellectual exercise because, other than like Texas, which there's a big Texas independence movement, has been for a long time, there isn't really any serious attempt for anyone to do so. And I don't even know what that would look like. On Twitter, when I posted about people like, well, who would get the nukes? And who would get the resources? And who would get the, And look, like, we're creative people. If it ever came to the circumstance where there was going to be a national divorce and a breakup into regional governments or whatever, like, we can figure that out. We can move warheads around. We can move military things and portion them, apportion them based on population or whatever, right? Like, this can be done peacefully. It doesn't have to be done through a civil war and total breakdown of society. Do I think it's going to happen? No, not really. But you might read the Book of Mormon here and say, well, all this was leading up in 3rd Nephi. These are all the chapters leading up to Christ coming. And so you can infer from here that these are at least in some manner descriptive of the events that are going to happen and leading up to Christ's return again. That these things have kind of patterns and prophecy here. And so perhaps one could conclude that this is part of our own future, that the people are so wicked and there's internal strife and so much pride and prosperity that people break up into their separate groups, still kind of keep the peace among them, but they're not righteous. But they're not going to war against one another because they're fighting a common enemy that they've identified as these secret combinations. Kind of interesting. So maybe there's something there that relates to our future. I just more find it an intellectual issue, and as someone who has studied a lot about the Constitution and history and so forth, I don't see it as anti-American. I see it as inherently American and rational for there to be union and consent. The consent of the governed, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, that there has to be the potential for disunion and dissent. And if you threaten to execute people who want to leave, then you don't have a union. You have something else entirely. See you next week.